For as long as humanity has walked the earth, we have looked up to the endless blue above and wondered. The birds, free and untouchable, soared where we could not. They crossed mountains, oceans, and the horizon itself, vanishing into the distance as if to taunt those of us chained to the ground. The dream of flight is as old as human imagination. Thousands of years before engines roared, before the word aerodynamics even existed, people dreamed of breaking gravity's grip. In every civilization, every era, someone tried to defy the skies. In ancient Greece, stories told of Daedalus and Icarus, a father and son who crafted wings from feathers and wax. They soared high into the heavens until Icarus flew too close to the sun and his wings melted away. It was a warning that flight was the domain of gods, not men. Yet, despite the tragedy, the story revealed something deeper, the eternal desire to touch the impossible. Far away in China, long before the birth of modern science, inventors were experimenting with kites, not toys, but tools of curiosity. As early as 400 BCE, the Chinese philosopher Mozi and his followers built large wooden kites capable of carrying human figures. They discovered lift and tension long before the West even dreamed of it. The simple act of a kite rising into the air carried a message. The skies could be mastered if only we understood their secrets. In ancient Egypt, murals depicted winged gods soaring through the heavens. To the pharaohs, the sky wasn't just space, it was a realm of power. And to many, flight symbolized freedom, transcendence, even immortality. But centuries passed. The dream remained a dream. It wasn't until the Renaissance that the idea of human flight became something more than myth. A man named Leonardo da Vinci, painter, sculptor, and visionary, began to ask the question no one else dared to. What if flight wasn't magic, but engineering? Da Vinci studied birds with the same care that others studied stars. He observed the movement of wings, the balance of air, the tilt of feathers in motion. His notebooks, filled with sketches and equations, revealed a mind centuries ahead of its time. He designed contraptions he called the ornithopter, a machine meant to flap wings like a bird. He drew parachutes, gliders, and even a primitive version of the modern helicopter, the aerial screw. None of his machines ever flew. The technology, the materials, the engines, all were beyond reach. But his imagination had already taken flight. He laid down the foundation. That flight could be achieved not by dreaming, but by understanding. Through the centuries that followed, curiosity gave birth to courage. The 1600s and 1700s became the age of experimentation. Scientists and inventors began to explore the laws of air itself. In 1647, Italian polymath Evangelista Torricelli discovered that air had weight, a shocking revelation for the time. This discovery changed everything. If air had weight, it could also provide resistance and perhaps lift. Then, in the 18th century, something extraordinary happened. Humankind flew for the first time, not with wings, but with fire. In 1783, in the small French town of Annonay, the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph and Etienne, filled a silk balloon with hot air. As the air heated, the balloon rose higher and higher into the sky, carrying with it a basket, and soon, a man. For the first time in recorded history, humans left the ground and stayed aloft. Crowds gathered. The King of France himself watched as man defied gravity. It was a moment that changed everything. The Montgolfier balloon was majestic, but it wasn't controlled. It drifted with the wind, directionless and uncertain. Humanity had finally risen from the ground. but it still couldn't command the skies. That challenge, to control flight, became the next great quest. Over the next century, inventors turned their eyes from balloons to wings once again. They began to study not just how to rise, but how to stay steady, how to steer, and how to land safely. In England, George Cayley, often called the father of aerodynamics, made one of the most important breakthroughs in the history of flight. In 1799, he sketched the design of a modern airplane, with a fixed wing, a fuselage, and a tail for stability. He didn't have the engines to power it, but he had the vision. Cayley built and tested gliders, learning that lift depended on the shape of the wing, not just its size. He identified the four forces that still define flight today: lift, drag, thrust, and weight. Those four words are the pillars of aviation science. By the mid-1800s, Cayley's experiments had proved one thing: flight was possible. What humanity needed next was power. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Steam, steel, and science began to rewrite the world. Trains raced across continents. Ships powered by engines crossed oceans. Electricity began to light cities. The impossible was becoming normal. In 1842, an English engineer named William Henson designed a flying machine called the aerial steam carriage. It was never built to scale, but it showed something new. The dream of flight was evolving from hobby to industry. A few decades later, John Stringfellow successfully flew a small steam-powered model aircraft indoors, the first powered flight of its kind. Steam engines were heavy, inefficient, and dangerous, but the principle was proven. Propulsion was the key. Meanwhile, in Germany, Otto Lilienthal, a man who would later inspire the Wright brothers, became obsessed with understanding how birds glide. He built dozens of gliders, tested them himself, and documented every flight. He believed that flight would come not from luck, but from data, from science. Between 1891 and 1896, Lilienthal made over 2,000 successful glider flights. He soared for short distances, sometimes hundreds of feet, balancing his body in the air like a bird. Crowds watched in awe. For the first time, people saw a man fly. But on August 9, 1896, tragedy struck. Lilienthal's glider stalled and crashed. He was mortally injured. His final words were haunting. Sacrifices must be made. Those words would echo in the hearts of two young brothers in America, who, inspired by Lilienthal's work, would finally conquer the skies. By the dawn of the 20th century, the dream of flight was closer than ever, yet still just out of reach. The problem wasn't just lift or thrust, it was control. Balloons could rise, gliders could glide, but no one could truly steer an aircraft with precision. In France, Clément Ader had built steam-powered aircraft that could lift slightly off the ground. In Britain, Percy Pilcher was making advances in gliders before his untimely death. Around the world, inventors were building prototypes, but every one of them faced the same wall: the inability to balance and maneuver safely in flight. The dream needed a revolution, not just in design, but in thinking. In a small bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, two brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, were quietly working on that revolution. They were not scientists by degree, nor engineers by training. They were craftsmen, bicycle makers with an obsession for precision and balance. But they possessed something far more powerful than credentials: curiosity. As children, they had been fascinated by a small toy helicopter powered by rubber bands. It could rise and hover for a few seconds before falling back down. That tiny toy lit a spark that never went out. The Wright brothers began studying every scrap of information about flight they could find. They devoured Otto Lilienthal's notes, read about Cayley's theories, and studied bird wings in motion. They realized something few others understood. That flight was a problem of control. Their journey, the story of how they turned that realization into the world's first powered flight, would change history forever. From ancient myths to scientific discovery, humanity's dream of flight has spanned centuries. But by the dawn of the 20th century, the question was no longer if humans could fly, but how. By the middle of the 19th century, Europe was changing faster than any generation could comprehend. Smoke rose from factories, locomotives cut through the countryside, and the word impossible was beginning to lose its meaning. Yet one frontier still refused to yield: the sky. The men who chased it were not ordinary scientists. They were misfits, tinkerers, and visionaries who lived halfway between failure and discovery. Otto Lilienthal, the man who taught the world to fly. In a quiet corner of Germany, a mechanical engineer named Otto Lilienthal spent his evenings watching birds. He wasn't watching their beauty. He was measuring their physics: the tilt of a wing, the sweep of a feather, the curve that caught the wind. He built gliders of willow and cloth, carried them up sandy hills, and threw himself into the air. Each jump lasted only seconds, but every second gave him data: numbers, notes, sketches. Between 1891 and 1896, he made more than 2,000 flights, often sailing gracefully for hundreds of feet before touching down on the slopes near Berlin. People gathered just to watch him. Newspapers called him the Flying Man. For the first time, the idea of a human gliding through open air wasn't fantasy. It was a photograph on the front page. Lilienthal proved that lift came from the curvature of a wing, not brute force. He catalogued every experiment in his book, Bird Flight, as the basis of aviation, which would later become a manual for the Wright brothers. Then, on an August afternoon in 1896, his glider stalled high above the dunes. The machine flipped and struck the ground. Lilienthal's spine broke. He died the next day, murmuring only, "Sacrifices must be made." Those 4 words echoed across continents. They were a vow that someone else would finish what he began. Percy Pilcher and the British Dream. Across the Channel, a young English naval officer named Percy Pilcher took up the same obsession. He built a series of gliders he named the Bat, the Beetle, the Gull, and finally, the Hawk. By 1897, Pilcher's flights stretched nearly 1,000 feet, the longest in history. He was weeks away from testing a new machine, powered not by muscle but by a lightweight engine he had designed himself. If he had lived a few more days, he might have beaten the Wrights to powered flight, but rain and wind sabotaged his final test. The glider collapsed mid-air. Pilcher was thrown to the ground and died 2 days later. Another pioneer gone, but his notebooks, like Lilienthal's, survived. Progress, though cruel, never truly stopped. Across the sea, America's first dreamer. While Europe chased gliders, America's inventors focused on power. Steam engines, internal combustion, the birth of industry. It was the land of invention. In 1868, John Stringfellow's experiments inspired a new generation. Octave Chanute, a civil engineer from Chicago, gathered every bit of global knowledge on flight and published it in 1894 as Progress in Flying Machines. Chanute's book became the encyclopedia of aviation. More importantly, he built his own gliders, strong, reliable, and remarkably safe. He tested them on the beaches of Lake Michigan, where steady winds mimicked the coastal breezes the Wrights would later seek. Chanute wasn't just building machines, he was building a network, sharing letters and designs with experimenters worldwide. Among his many correspondents were 2 bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio, Samuel Langley, Science meets ambition. At the same time, one of America's most respected scientists, Samuel Pierpont Langley, director of the Smithsonian Institution, was convinced that flight would come through precise mathematics. He built small powered models called aerodromes. Using miniature steam engines, he achieved flights of nearly a minute, the longest anyone had seen. Congress noticed. The US War Department granted Langley $50,000, a fortune, to scale his design up and carry a man. On October 7, 1903, his full-size aerodrome was launched from a catapult over the Potomac River. It plunged straight into the water. The second attempt, in December, ended the same way. The newspapers were merciless. 2 months later, on a quiet beach in North Carolina, 2 unknown brothers would succeed where the great scientist had failed. A pattern of persistence. The closing years of the 19th century felt like a race, one that no one could quite finish. Each inventor added a piece: lift from Cayley, structure from Stringfellow, control from Lilienthal, power from Langley. But the puzzle was still missing its center. A way to make all those forces work together in harmony. The answer would not come from a laboratory or a university. It would come from a dusty bicycle shop in the American Midwest, a place where gears and chains would become wings and propellers. When we trace the path from Da Vinci's sketches to the end of the 19th century, one truth stands out. Flight was never the work of a single genius. It was a relay, each dreamer passing the torch to the next. They worked without blueprints, without engines light enough, or theories complete enough. They risked their reputations, their fortunes, and often their lives for an idea the world still laughed at. But by the year 1900, the laughter had grown quiet. Newspapers printed photographs of gliders in flight. Children built model wings from paper. The idea of human flight was no longer heresy. It was destiny waiting for its moment. That moment was approaching fast, carried by 2 men whose patience, precision, and persistence would reshape the modern world. The dream was ready. The science was nearly there. All it needed was a spark, and 2 brothers who believed the wind itself could be measured, mastered, and molded. By the last decade of the 19th century, humanity stood on the edge of its oldest dream. The gliders of Otto Lilienthal had proven that a person could ride the air. The challenge now was not just to float, but to command the sky. Every continent seemed to hold a handful of restless inventors, convinced that the answer was only one design away. The newspapers called them birdmen. Farmers called them fools. But the truth was that a silent race had begun, one that would decide who would leave the ground first under their own power. The turn of a century. The year was 1890. Steam ruled the earth, electricity was still a novelty, and the word aeroplane barely existed. Yet ideas were crossing borders faster than ships could carry them. A single sketch published in London might be copied in New York within weeks. Clubs, salons, and workshops buzzed with rumours. Someone in France has flown a machine. A German engineer has a wing that can lift a man. An American professor says he can conquer gravity. But behind the excitement was frustration. Balloons had given humanity altitude. Gliders had given control. What no one could yet find was power light enough to fly. Engines of the day were built for ships, not wings. A motor that could lift its own weight was an engineer's fantasy. Still, that didn't stop the dreamers. Clément Ader and the bat. In France, an eccentric inventor named Clément Ader turned his home into a laboratory of feathers and steam. A trained engineer and accomplished electrician, Ader believed that flight would come by imitating nature itself. His aircraft, which he called Éole, looked like a massive bat, a dark creature of silk and steel with flapping wings driven by a light steam engine. In 1890, on a field outside Paris, Ada opened the throttle. The machine rattled forward, lifted briefly, perhaps 20 centimeters off the ground, and settled again. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was real flight, powered and heavier than air. He improved his design for years, building Avian 2 and Avian 3 with government funding. They were magnificent, but uncontrollable. When Avian 3 crashed during trials, the French army withdrew support. The project ended in ridicule, and Ada retreated into silence. Yet he had given the world two things: the French word for airplane, avian, and proof that the line between dream and achievement was razor thin. Lawrence Hargrave and the box kite. Half a world away in Australia, a quiet inventor named Lawrence Hargrave worked not in cities, but on the beaches of New South Wales. He believed that nature's secrets could be found in patience, not spectacle. He studied the wings of seagulls, built models of flapping mechanisms, and finally created the box kite, two cells joined by bracing that gave extraordinary stability. In 1894, his tethered kites lifted him 16 feet into the air. It wasn't flight in the modern sense, but it was balance, stability, something gliders desperately lacked. His box kite principle would later inspire the very wings the Wrights used at Kitty Hawk. Hargrave refused to patent his work. "When men are at last able to fly," he wrote, "let them owe it to the efforts of those who freely gave their knowledge." The French Circle. If Paris had lost faith in Adair, it quickly found new prophets. Inventors like Victor Tatin, Gabriel Voisin, and Alphonse Pénaud filled the air with small whirring models. Pénaud's twisted rubber motor, invented in the 1870s, made possible the first sustained toy flights, and more importantly, taught future engineers about balance and torque. In 1879, Victor Tatin built a small monoplane powered by compressed air. It rolled along a circular track, took off under its own power, and flew freely, a tiny miracle that proved powered flight wasn't forbidden by physics. By the end of the century, France had become Europe's aeronautical capital. Balloonists, engineers, and dreamers gathered at the Parc d'Aérostation in Paris, trading sketches and gossip like soldiers preparing for war. They believed flight would be born on French soil. The German engineers. Germany, meanwhile, had turned Lilienthal's tragedy into a movement. Engineers such as Gustav Lilienthal, Otto's brother, and Carl Wilhelm Otto Keller continued to refine the glider. At the Technical University of Berlin, students debated wing curvature and drag coefficients with the same fervour others reserved for politics. In 1897, Otto Hollerith proposed a biplane with forward elevators, a configuration that would later echo in the Wright's Flyer. Others tested tail rudders, warped wings, and wire-braced frames. Germany's contribution was discipline, precise measurements, repeatable experiments, and the first wind tunnel tests of wing sections. Science was replacing luck. Octave Chanute and the American Connection. Across the Atlantic, a retired railroad engineer named Octave Chanute became the quiet center of the global network. Fluent in both French and English, he corresponded with inventors on 3 continents. Where others guarded secrets, Chanute published everything. His 1894 book, Progress in Flying Machines, gathered the scattered knowledge of the world into one volume. But he wasn't just a historian, he was a builder. On the sand dunes near Chicago, he tested gliders with a team of young enthusiasts, including August Herring. Their biplane designs introduced struts and wires arranged in a truss, a structure both strong and light. It was a concept borrowed from bridges and applied to wings, and it would become the skeleton of modern aircraft. Chanute's camp became a classroom for the next generation. Letters from Germany, France, and Britain arrived weekly, and one day a note came from Dayton, Ohio, from two brothers who repaired bicycles and had questions about flight. Samuel Langley's great experiment. While Chanute built gliders, the official scientific establishment pinned its hopes on Samuel Pierpont Langley, Secretary of the Smithsonian. Langley believed that if you solved the math, nature would follow. His small, steam-powered models, delicate craft with twin wings and propellers, flew for nearly a minute over the Potomac in 1896. The press called them miracles. President McKinley called them proof of American genius. The War Department granted Langley a huge sum to build a full-scale man-carrying version. He hired the best machinists in Washington and designed a new catapult launch system from a houseboat anchored on the river. But when the day came, October 7, 1903, the machine shot forward, buckled, and smashed into the water. A second attempt in December ended the same way. The newspapers mocked him. Langley's flying machine goes fishing. Crushed by humiliation, Langley abandoned the project. 2 months later, a quiet flight on a Carolina beach would rewrite history and redeem all who had failed. The meaning of the race. To the outside world, these experiments looked disconnected, scattered sparks that flared and faded. But together they formed a chain reaction. Each failure supplied a measurement, a drawing, a photograph, a new material. Every wrecked glider was a lesson carved into wood and canvas. The race toward the skies was never about competition alone. It was about patience. Ada gave courage, Hargrave stability, Lilienthal control, Langley power, and Chanute the bridge that tied them all together. By 1900, the dream no longer belonged to poets or madmen. It belonged to engineers, and to two brothers in Dayton who were studying every one of these men in obsessive detail. Their names were Orville and Wilbur Wright, and while the world chased fame and funding, they were quietly chasing data.